Hi, my name is Danger, and I welcome you to my presentation on Harakat al-Maqawam al-Islamiyah, or Hamas. So here's what we're going to go over. This will be an analysis of the history, ideology, financing, and impact of Hamas. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between Hezbollah and Hamas and discuss the ethical considerations in attempted interventions. Hamas was founded by Sheikh Yassin, an Egyptian Sunni Muslim. Hamas started as a peaceful initiative during the Palestinian uprising against Israel in 1987. In fact, their focus was on social work, and they were known for their community service, especially building and managing schools, orphanages, mosques, sports facilities, and makeshift health clinics for wounded Palestinians. Unfortunately, this didn't last long, and in 1989, Hamas joined the uprising, known as the First Intifada, and began attacking Israel with guerrilla warfare and suicide bombings. Sheikh Yassin was implicated in the kidnapping and execution of 2 Israeli soldiers and was sentenced to life in prison, though he only stayed for a decade before being released and was assassinated a few years later. In 1988, Hamas released a charter that outlined their philosophy, and in the charter they declared themselves an enemy to Israel, the United States, and anyone else who would advocate for Israel's right to exist. Hamas is actually an acronym of the name Islamic Resistance Movement in Arabic, but the very word Hamas ironically means zeal or violence in the Arabic language. However, Hamas wouldn't want to be classified simply as a resistance to Israel, but rather they'd like to be known as a Sunni Islam organization whose sole purpose is to raise the Islamic banner in anticipation for the Battle of Gog and Magog, which is a prophesied battle in the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scriptures. In the Jewish and Christian scriptures, Israel is prophesied to conquer its Arab opposition, whereas in the Islamic version, Muslims are said to conquer Israel. But it was this charter, in conjunction with their violent acts, that led them to be classified as terrorists basically everywhere outside of Palestine. A quick note here, because Hamas and Hezbollah are often associated with one another and their names are erroneously interchanged. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization that was founded prior to the Palestinian uprising, and they were essentially the blueprint for Hamas, which is probably one reason why they're so often commingled together. But Hezbollah primarily operates in Lebanon and is founded under Shiite Islam rather than Sunni. This may seem like a small difference, but grouping Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims under the same umbrella is perhaps similar to grouping Southern Baptist Christians under the same umbrella as Eastern Orthodox Christians. Hezbollah has been a political party for decades and has had ready access to sophisticated weapons like missiles, aircrafts, and armored vehicles, as well as the basic stuff like AKs and RPGs. So the biggest difference between the two is that Hezbollah has been a lot more established and been given greater recognition over the years. And not to mention, Hamas is primarily concerned with Palestinian affairs, while Hezbollah's main focus is on Syrian affairs. Because Hamas only operates in Palestine, they're inherently weak. Palestine is a poor region, and as such, Hamas is dependent on outside donations to stay afloat. Initially, this was primarily the Saudi Arabian government that funded them, but they've since gotten significant support from Syria, Iran, Qatar, and the other Gulf states. Today, they're headquartered in Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, but they have full political control of Gaza. As previously noted, Hamas is not as equipped as some other terrorist organizations, and therefore they rely on guerrilla warfare as their main modality of terrorism. This means that they don't have the resources to pull off an attack like the September 11th attacks perpetrated by al-Qaeda, but rather Hamas relies on small arms fire, rocket attacks, and improvised bombs to inflict violence. Their use of suicide bombers gained momentum in the 1990s, and they fiercely opposed the 1993 Oslo Accords, which was the peace treaty between Palestine and Israel to end the First Intifada. In the year 2000, the Second Intifada broke out, largely as a result of Hamas's continued opposition to the peace treaty. They've also assisted Hezbollah after the Second Lebanon Wars broke out in 2006. And one strategy that Hamas uses that's perhaps undervalued is their mastery of music and propaganda. Hamas has been able to subtly inject anti-Israel messages in mainstream music, even establishing an anti-Israel boy band named Protectors of the Homeland, if you can believe that. Hamas favors music because, unlike other weapons, music is untouchable. They spread messages through music to prepare, motivate, focus, signal commands, unify participation, share experiences, and to fill the purpose of creating an untouchable space for the adversaries. And that comes from Karen in 2012. The impact of Hamas should not be understated. Their actions create an unsafe environment in Israel and Gaza, and it keeps the Israeli government's finger on the trigger, thickening the tension between Israelis and Palestinians. There's a loss of home, limb, and life, not just for Israelis, but often Palestinians too, especially children. And we know that trauma in children can significantly impact their development during these critical years. And what perpetuates the cycle more than anything else is that Israelis look at these acts and they feel justified in their violent actions towards Palestinians. So Hamas not only hurts the Jewish community, but also the Arab community. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict and every component of it's a sensitive matter. As such, there are many ethical considerations here. And the first is that many of the victims of Hamas are also perpetrators. The Israeli military has been accused of human rights abuses against the Palestinian people, and there's a amount of evidence to support this. If you were to ask Hamas, they tell you that this is why they need to respond with violence, that they're just reciprocating. While the actions of Hamas are condemnable and unequivocally wrong, they're often not unprovoked. It's important to keep this in mind that any assistance with the Israeli community is automatically seen as a political stance, especially if you're an American. The U.S. has already been accused of enabling Israel to commit human rights violations, and any effort to help the Israeli side of the conflict will automatically be perceived as taking a hardline stance in the conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just one chapter of the Israeli-Arab conflict that spanned millennia, and is probably the longest-standing ethnic conflict in the history of the world. So we need to be careful not to come at this situation with the arrogant assumption that there's a whole lot we can do to add to the conversation, as it's one that's gone on since the time of the biblical Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael. If you spent your entire life studying this conflict, you'd only understand a sliver of the issues at play here. Thank you for listening in on my presentation. My hope is that you learned a thing or two about Hamas. Thanks.